Okay, so here is the untouchability argument. Here's the first premise. I'm going to do this a little differently than normal. Usually we lay out the entire argument and then we go defend the premises. I'm going to do defenses as we go. So I'm not going to lay out the whole thing until we've defended both the premises. I think that this will just make the force of the argument a little clearer. Okay, so the first premise is this. It's an untouchable fact that the state of the world 2 million years ago, I've picked an arbitrary, and so did he, an arbitrary time in the world's development. The crucial thing is that that time be a time that was long before human beings were around, right? It doesn't have to be that many million. As long as it's a time before there were human beings, the argument will work. It's an untouchable fact that the state of the world 2 million years ago was S, and that the laws of nature were L1 through Ln. Here's the idea, and here's the defense of this first premise. We're letting S be whatever the state of the world was at some arbitrary moment at, noon, high noon at the 2 million years ago, 2 million BC, let's say, which is not exactly 2 million years ago, but we'll say 2 million BCE. So we have an exact year. So here's our silly little representation of what S is supposed to be. Remember, the state of the world at a given moment is just a complete description of everything that exists and all of its properties, all the properties of every existing thing at that time. So we're just letting S pick out in this particular use of S. We're just letting it pick out whatever exactly the details of the state of the world were back then. Throw those all into the basket, call that S. UA1 is pretty uncontroversial. It doesn't just say that the state of the world was S. That's just kind of by stipulation, whatever it was. It also adds, we can't change that fact. Again, given that you've picked an arbitrary time long before there were human beings, trivially, it's going to be true that it's an untouchable fact that the state of the world was S. And furthermore, it's going to be an untouchable fact that the laws of nature were what they were back then, and indeed are what they continue to be, given that the laws of nature don't change. No one really fights about the fact that the past is untouchable in this sense. And I shouldn't say no one. There have been philosophers, but for the most part, this isn't the locus of controversy. Okay, so I can't change the distant past. Here's the second premise. It's an untouchable fact that if the state of the world was S and the laws were L1 through Ln in 2 million BCE, I've got slightly different. In the first premise, I've got 2 million years ago. In the second one, I've got 2 million BCE. Swap out the 2 million years ago in the first premise for 2 million BCE if you really want to be precise. It's an untouchable fact that if the state of the world was S and the laws were L1 through Ln in 2 million BCE, then JB eats waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/16/21. Who's JB? That's me, Jonathan Parker. That's tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. I'm recording this on Thursday, so when you view this, that will have been 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the morning that you view it. This asserts that some conditional fact is untouchable. It's important to see that this is not asserting yet that my eating waffles at 7 in the morning on April 16th, it's not asserting yet that that is untouchable, because that's going to be the conclusion of the argument. Nor, in fact, is it asserting that the fact that the state of the world was S and the laws of nature were what they were 2 million years ago is untouchable. That's the job of the first premise. Instead, it's asserting that that entire conditional is untouchable. UA2 says, look, if the state of the world was S and the laws of nature were what they were 2 million years ago, then it was fixed and determined that I would eat waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/16. Necessarily, if the state of the world was what it was, then I'm going to eat those waffles. There's no other possible future given that state of the past. And furthermore, it asserts that that fact, that conditional fact, that fact that the distant past brings about a waffle-eating future of necessity in that way, that's an untouchable fact. I can't change it. I can't change the fact that the distant past is so related as a function to the future. So here's defense and explanation of UA2. It's important to see that UA2, in order to defend it, we have to assume that determinism is true. Because UA2 is asserting that if the state of the world was S and the laws were what they were, then I eat waffles on 7 a.m., blah, blah, blah. In other words, it's asserting that the past determines the future, among other things. That's what it's asserting. If you're not a determinist, if determinism is false, then it's not going to be true that necessarily if the state of the world was that way, then I'm going to eat waffles, because there are possibilities in which, although the state of the world in the past was that way, I choose to have no breakfast at all. So first you need to assume that determinism is true. Here's determinism again. It follows from this assumption that if the state of the world and the laws were what they were 2 million years ago, then I eat waffles on 4/16. So here's state of the past with all its little details. And UA2 asserts the following, and not just the following, but asserts at least this, that that state in the past determined a waffle-eating future. It also asserts, crucially though, that, I think I removed that slide. It also asserts crucially that that conditional fact, that fact that if the past was the way it was, then I eat waffles, that's untouchable. That's untouchable. So, in addition to just asserting this deterministic relationship between what the dinosaurs were doing and my eating waffles, it says, I can't change anything about the fact that the past is related to the future in this way. One way to think about this is that UA2 is asserting, if determinism's true, that's not something I have control over. Indeed, if it's false, it's not something I have control over. Determinism's truth or falsity is something like whether God exists or whether the PSR is true, right? Like, we can find out whether, hopefully, whether these things are true or false, but we can't do anything to change them. We can't just be like, dang it, I really hate that determinism's true. I'm going to go out and change that fact. Like, if it's true, it's true. Then there's nothing we can do about it. If it's false, it's false. That's what UA2 is asserting. Here's the conclusion. Therefore, it is an untouchable fact that I eat waffles at 7 a.m. on April 16th. Here's me. This conclusion, UA3, says the fact that I eat waffles at that time is an untouchable fact. Is this argument valid? This is a complicated argument, one of the hardest that we've discussed so far, so I'm going real slow. And to harken back to what we did at the very beginning of the semester, when we're trying to assess an argument, we ask, is it valid, is it sound? Is it valid, or the argument's premise is true? So with validity, we can't just say, well, duh, it's valid because it's modus ponens, because it's not a modus ponens argument. And this is where Van Inwagen's principle is critical. If this is a valid argument form, that principle, in 1 through 3 that I've got displayed down there at the bottom, then the untouchability argument is logically valid. And as we saw, Van Inwagen gives us an instance of that argument form that he says should convince us that every instance of it is valid, and so the argument form itself is valid. I just want to invite you to consider, do you think that principle is true? Is this in general a valid argument form? Swap out P's and Q's as you like and see if you can come up with true premises and a false conclusion. And if you can, then that means that the untouchability argument, because it has that form, is not valid. The second question is, whether the premises are true. Before we get there, though, I want to just note a few points of clarification. So the first clarification question that is relevant here is this. What does UA3, which is the argument's conclusion, what does this have to do with free will? We're like, 5 steps deep into the weeds with defined concepts and variables and laws of nature and stuff. And you might be like, what happened to freedom? We're not even talking about freedom anymore. So let's just get clear on that. And then the second is, why is this an argument for incompatibilism when the conclusion is basically, I'm not free to eat waffles? Isn't that just an argument that, for the conclusion that there's no freedom, which is not incompatibilism? That's just an assertion that FW1 in our problem of free will is false. Okay, so the first clarification question, what does UA3 have to do with free will? Here's the conclusion. It is an untouchable fact that I eat waffles at 7 a.m. To see what this has to do with free will, remember what an untouchable fact is. Untouchable fact is a fact that no one ever has the power to do anything to change. Among other things, if something is an untouchable fact, that means that I don't have the power to change it. And so if UA3 is true, that implies that not only is my eating waffles at 7 a.m. untouchable, but in particular, I do not have the power to change the fact that I eat waffles at 7 a.m. Now recall our ability to do otherwise condition, or AO, for freedom. At the very beginning, in laying out what freedom is supposed to be, we discussed this idea of the garden of forking paths, and we made that a little bit more precise and said, here's a baseline necessary condition for freedom. The reason why you're not free when you're locked in a jail cell is that you have no other option but to remain in the jail cell. That's your only future. The reason why you're not free if you're addicted to drugs is that the drug itself is closing off futures in which you don't take the drug, right? The reason, on the other hand, why your decision to go to Wake as opposed to Duke felt free was that it felt like at the time, if you chose to go to Wake, you didn't have to do that. You could have done something else. X does A freely only if, and this means that this is required for freedom. It's not sufficient, but it's a baseline minimal condition. X does A freely at T only if X has the power to do otherwise than A at T. If you don't have the ability to do anything other than A, then A is your only option, and so you're not free. All parties, pretty much, to the debate over free will, okay, let me qualify that. Most parties to the debate over free will agree that AO is a necessary condition for freedom, whatever freedom turns out to be, and whether or not it exists. UA3, if it's true, establishes that I don't have the power to change the fact that I'm eating waffles for breakfast at 7 a.m. That's just another way of saying that when I am eating waffles for breakfast at 7 a.m., I don't have the ability to do anything else. There's nothing else I could have done. I do not have the power to do otherwise than eat waffles. Over here on the right, we've got a diagram that's like a forking paths kind of diagram. This is what it would take for AO to be true of me in this particular circumstance. It would require that when I am making the choice about what to eat, I have many possible futures compatible with the past and laws of nature open to me. Waffle eating future, toast eating future. Oh, the third one is supposed to have nothing because that's supposed to be a one in which I don't eat any breakfast, but I guess I've got 2 toast eating possible futures here. But at the very least, I have to be able to do something other than eat waffles. And in effect, what UA3 tells us is that since my eating waffles is an untouchable fact, I don't meet the ability to do otherwise condition. My future does not have this branching structure. Instead, I've just got one possible future, the waffle eating future, which is, hey, I mean, if you're going to pick a future to be determined, eating waffles is not that bad, I suppose. But nevertheless, it's not free, and that's not great either. So my eating waffles at 7 a.m. was not free. So this is the connection between the idea of untouchable facts and the idea of freedom. The bridge there, and this is important, I want you to know it, the bridge is between the bridge between untouchable facts and freedom runs through the ability to do otherwise condition. And that's why we did so much work early on to get clear on that condition, is that that's an essential piece of this puzzle. It's not really a piece that anyone tries to push back against. And that's why Van Inwagen, in having established UA3, basically treats that as equivalent to having established that there's not freedom. Because the AO condition there, although it's sort of hidden, is not really controversial. The last thing I want to note here is this, of course, is not unique to like me. It's not unique to my eating waffles for breakfast at that time. It's not unique to any of the particulars that we've substituted in. I invite you to swap in yourself and something that you do, maybe something you think is a particularly important decision you made. Swap that in this argument as you remember it, and I think it'll probably help you remember it and understand it. The argument will still work. For any action that any human being could ever do and any choice any human being could ever make, we could construct an instance of the untouchability argument with the conclusion that that action and that choice is untouchable. And so more generally, the untouchability argument, if it works in one instance, it establishes that no one's ever free. There is no freedom. Which brings us back to the second question, which we've already previewed, but I want to circle back to it and close here. Why is this an argument for incompatibilism, as opposed to just an argument for the conclusion that there's no free will? Remember that in the defense of UA2, we essentially relied on the assumption that determinism is true. If we hadn't relied on that assumption, then it would be false that if the state of the world 2 million years ago was S and the laws were what they were, then I'd eat waffles. That conditional would be false because there would be non-waffle eating futures consistent with that state of the past 2 million years ago in the laws of nature. So we had to build the success of that argument is builds upon the assumption of determinism. So here it is in UA2. You see, in effect, the direct logical consequence of the truth of determinism there in the if-then claim. So this is the basis of, this is why this is an argument for incompatibilism. Because in effect, although the conclusion is that I'm not free, in order to get to the conclusion, we had to rely on the assumption of determinism. And so the way to think about this argument is, assuming determinism, then no freedom. Assuming determinism, then no freedom. And that is just incompatibilism, FW2. If determinism is true, then there is no free will. Anyone who accepts FW2 is an incompatibilist, and so they must reject, to go back to where we started, FW1, FW2, or both. Next time we'll talk about what happens if you reject FW1 as an incompatibilist. What does libertarian incompatibilism look like? See you there.